Welcome to Diane Marie Home, where I share DIY, gardening, cooking from scratch, and creating cozy spaces on a budget in our 1800s farmhouse in upstate New York. Today I'm sharing how to grow tulips as a cut flower. A lot of people don't know this, but growing tulips as a cut flower is completely different than growing tulips in your garden bed. I live in an area where tulips can perennialize, and so a lot of people assume that when you're growing tulips as cut flowers, it's the same thing and they'll come back year after year, but unfortunately, this just isn't the case, and there are a lot of differences. Growing tulips as cut flowers are almost like growing a completely different type of flower. I'll get more into the details of this, but one of the main differences in growing tulips as a cut flower is how they're planted. Instead of spacing the bulbs apart, you plant them egg carton style, which is very close together, leaving just about an inch space in between the bulbs. You can see this full bed of tulips were planted in that egg carton style and how they just grow very closely and it's condensed. It saves space and it just allows for the stems to grow tall and upright. Now, if you were growing tulips as a perennial, you would never want to grow them this way because you would want to give each bulb its own space to grow over time. But why that doesn't matter for tulips as cut flowers is because when you harvest them, you actually have to harvest the entire bulb. And this is for a few reasons. One, it helps with storing the tulips. Tulips can be stored in the fridge for 1 to 2 weeks, and they do best when they either have the bulb attached or when they are in a bucket of water. But you also want to remove that bulb to increase the stem length, which is something that's really important when you're growing and harvesting flowers to sell as cut flowers. You want the longest stem length that you can get. So you can see a video of me here harvesting these tulips. I just hold the stem as close to the bulb as I can get and then slowly wiggle until the entire plant lifts up. I found that planting tulips in raised beds or very loose soil makes harvesting much easier. When I plant in more dense soil, it makes it nearly impossible to pull the plant without snapping the stem off of the bulb. Another bummer about growing tulips as cut flowers is that when you go to process the stem and you cut the bulb off, you really can't do anything other than compost it, because in order for a stem to rejuvenate for the following year, it needs foliage to re-energize the bulb. And when you're cutting off the entire stem for stem length for the cut flower, the bulb won't have anything to gain energy for the following year, so it's just going to rot in the ground anyways. The other piece to that is that tulips bred for cut flowers just aren't designed to come back year after year. So that's not to say that they won't perennialize. I have had success with some varieties, especially Exotic Emperor and Angelique, returning year after year if I don't harvest the flower and it has enough stem left to rejuvenate the bulb for the following year. But then there were other varieties. A couple years ago, I planted yellow pompette and there was a total crop failure due to weather. So I figured I'll just leave the bulbs in the ground and let them grow the following year and use them then. But they did not come back. The entire patch, not one of them came back. So certain varieties will perennialize, others won't, but it's just not very reliable. So when you're growing flowers and you're counting on them for your sales, you really need to order these bulbs in and just treat them as an annual. Every year I find myself questioning if I should continue to grow these flowers to sell because they are so labor intensive. The bulbs themselves are pretty expensive. And when you take into consideration the amount of time that it takes to plant these flowers in the fall and then harvest them in the spring, it's just kind of tricky to rationalize on paper. But oh my goodness, these flowers are just so pretty. And that's what keeps me growing them, because they're one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring and they're just so beautiful and come in so many different colors and forms, and keeps me growing them every year, even though I'm probably losing money if I account for my time and effort. Something that is really nice about tulips is that they can easily be stored for 1 to 2 weeks using a fridge or a cooler that is between 32 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit. I use an old fridge in my grow room, and I just pack that full of tulips starting at the beginning of May because tulips are the main flower that I sell for Mother's Day. I actually pair them with pennycress that grows wild in our larger field, and I love the combination of the two. The tulips and the pennycress are so pretty in bouquets, but since the tulips will come on at different times, and this year we actually had unusually warm weather early on, so the tulips started opening a lot sooner than they normally would. Luckily, I only plant late varieties. Tulips will come in early, mid, and late season varieties. And so it was closer to that Mother's Day mark that I shoot for, but I relied on my fridge this year more than ever to have enough tulips for Mother's Day sales this year. In order to get the best storage out of your tulips and also the longest vase life, it's important to harvest them at the correct time. So a common mistake that I see new flower farmers doing is waiting until the tulips are fully open and at their peak, but this is not going to allow for the longest vase life. You really want to pick tulips when they are just starting to show color, when they're cracked open and starting to show color. And I like to pick some at this stage and then others at kind of the stage that you see in this picture where they're kind of like that fluffy marshmallow stage where they're not fully open, but you can see what they're going to look like. I found that people buying flowers, it's harder for them to visualize what they're getting into if the flower has very little color to it and isn't open yet. So I like to do a mix, and then that will extend the vase life for whoever's buying them. Now in this clip, I'm just showing how I make my wrap bouquets of tulips, and this is another strong point for tulips is I find them so easy to arrange because you really don't have to do anything. You just have to bunch them together. I like to just lay one on top of each other until I get to the total number, and then I can wrap them in the bouquet, and they look so nice. Where I find with other flowers, when I go to put them in a bouquet, I tend to mess around with them more, and it's just harder to get them to look exactly how I want them, where tulips just fall into place perfectly all on their own. When I started, I was using this plain brown craft paper for the classic market bouquet, but then I had the idea to use this pink paper for a special Mother's Day bouquet option, and I just love the way it makes the tulips pop with the pink paper. There's just not much that beats a beautiful bouquet of double tulips, and the pink paper is just the icing on the cake. I've also found that black paper makes a really nice wrap as well. It just really brings out the beauty of the flowers and really makes their colors pop. Something to be aware of with tulips is they're kind of unique in that after they're picked, their stem will actually keep growing. So when you arrange tulips, expect for them to be an inch or two higher, a few days after you make that arrangement. They will just keep growing in the vase, and it's kind of crazy how that happens. So usually when I'm making bouquets, I'll sit them just below the paper, knowing that they will continue to grow above it. Tulips make such a great cut flower because they do have such strong, long stems. However, one of the common problems with tulips when they're being grown as cut flowers is sometimes they will bloom on short stems. And this is another reason why it's tricky to grow them as cut flowers, because you just don't know if it's going to happen. But one of the main contributors to why that happens is infrequent watering throughout their growing process. So if you live in a particularly dry climate, you might want to consider watering your tulips even in the winter, especially early in the spring when they, start to emerge, because that will allow the plant to form those long stems, which is what you need when you are growing tulips with the intent of selling them as a cut flower. I have a fully detailed post over on the blog about how to grow and harvest tulips as cut flowers, along with common problems and how to avoid them. So be sure to check that out. The link will be in the description. But if you see a bouquet of locally grown tulips this year, just know that a lot of love went into producing those. Thank you for hanging out with me today and admiring all of these beautiful tulips. I will see you in the next video.